Hello world, welcome to a new video. Today the topic is autism. Dan Yedinak is with us today. He's going to share about 30 minutes about what autism is and a lot of information for awareness. So I hope you like this video. If you do, please comment on the section below and follow along. If you want to reach out to Dan, his email is in the last slide. I've also added those to the description below. So please let us know what you think. I hope you enjoy.
There was some conversation here, one of the last ones, then the basic question came up about what is autism. I'm going to tell you right here and now, I'm not going to be able to answer that question in 30 minutes. I do have a lot of information to provide, so I'm going to slide through really fast. I'm going to talk really fast, just so that we can kind of get to the meat of the information, or at least as best we can. And to start with, I just figured some really basic, definitions would be in order. So generally speaking, when we're talking about autism, we're talking about ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, or autism spectrum of disorders. Most of the people in this room know this, but spectrum is, used to classify, things generally in terms of two, opposite positions. Although the reality of the autism spectrum is it doesn't quite fit that model, but at the time that they came up with the term, it sort of seemed to apply. DSM is an acronym for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is what medical professionals use as the basis for making a determination of autism or autism spectrum, along with a lot of other disorders. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. It was first passed in 1975 and modified in 1990, and it basically requires that public schools provide a free and appropriate public education to children with disabilities. Incidence and prevalence are both kind of used interchangeably everywhere that you look at statistics and data on autism. And again, most of the people in this room probably actually know these definitions, but there we are, we're going to talk about them. One of the questions that came up before was about how autism is diagnosed, and it is a clinical diagnosis, and that's probably one of the most significant takeaways here, is that it is not based on laboratory tests or imaging tests, like so many other medical conditions. It's based on clinical diagnosis or clinical observation by trained medical professionals. And there are a variety of standards that are used in that measurement, but that adds to a lot of the question about what is autism. So. A lot of the things that you'll hear about is things that have to do with language when it comes to autism. And so there are two basic types of language that we have, and one is receptive, which is our ability to understand language. If you think about, oftentimes if you are learning another language, for example, you might be able to understand what's being said to you, even if you can't come up with the words and say it back. So that would be an example of receptive language, right? Expressive language, of course, is the exact opposite. It's our ability to use especially verbal language to express ourselves and our thoughts and ideas. Prosody is one of my favorite elements of autism in particular. It's present in all language, but it's how we use inflections to change the emphasis on a topic. So my favorite example of that from an autism researcher actually was the spot is on the brown cow. Tells you that the spot is on the brown cow as opposed to, say, on the grass, right? As opposed to the spot is on the brown cow. I've emphasized brown to emphasize that it's on the brown cow as opposed to, say, the blue cow, right? So this is telling me which cow the spot is on. And that is, that's an issue, especially in some individuals on the autism spectrum. Echolalia is something that you see a lot in specific instances of autism, and that is when somebody hears what you're saying and says it right back to you. Kids do this a lot, right? Young kids, they like to just repeat everything that somebody says, and somebody's like, stop copying me, right? So this is echolalia. And there are some individuals who cannot process at a conversational speed language, and so what they do is they spit back what they've just heard. Sensory integration or sensory processing disorder is a total rewiring of the sensory system. And it's something that it is not officially in the DSM, but all of its subcategories, and it's literally its own big bowl of diagnoses, and there are people working on trying to get it into the DSM. But basically, certain things that we're able to tune out, right, that we learn to tune out over time, a lot of individuals on the spectrum, they simply cannot do that. And so, things like, fans buzzing or lights flickering, that can really be overstimulating. And in other cases, things that should be, experienced at a heightened level aren't. So we're talking about at a neurological level, a complete rewiring of our sensory, senses of hearing, touch, smell, and so forth. Comorbidity is having one or more disorders and diseases at the same time. And this is another really critical element of autism, because just because you're diagnosed with autism doesn't mean that you don't have other things. You could have ADHD, you could have cancer, you can have any number of different things, and they can all exist at the same time, and that really complicates diagnosis later on. So big question here, disorder versus disease. So just from a definitional standpoint, a disorder is typically a psychological pattern associated with disability or distress that occurs in an individual and is not part of the normal development or culture, right? So how you define that, right, that varies from culture to culture, right? And that can be really important as you're looking at something like autism, which is a global issue. Now, a disease can cause a disorder, but typically is caused by external factors like pathogens. Now, since more often than not, when you start talking about diseases, right, you think about things that are infectious that can be passed from one person to the next. And for that reason, typically, even though disease really technically, is correct when it comes to autism, disorder is the term that we generally use when we're talking about autism spectrum disorders, because of course you can't catch autism from somebody, right? Now, there are a variety of different categories of autism, and this is something that's been changing, over the years, in part because it's so difficult to actually, identify what is autism. But typically, if you hear somebody talking about just plain autism, it's generally classic autism, and so this is often, a real lack of expressive language in particular. It can come with cognitive issues, developmental learning issues, and a whole range of other issues. So more often than not, somebody that's classically autistic generally has a really hard time fitting into society and being productive. There are things changing in that arena, which is good. But Asperger's was eliminated, as I mentioned. The DSM has been changing. Asperger's has typically been referred to as high-functioning autism. So there are a variety of characters that you've seen in mainstream media that portray Asperger's or high-functioning autism. Whether or not something is actually high-functioning versus low-functioning is something that we're still trying to determine, because of that expressive language being such a key component of intellectual quotient type tests. So we really don't have a good handle on what intelligence is when it comes to autism, because of that difficulty with expressive language. By far and away, the biggest group of people diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and where Asperger's now generally fits, is the pervasive developmental disorders not otherwise specified. This is also where childhood disintegrative disorder comes in, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. Now, these first four, these are the ones that you see most often. The other two at the end there, Rett syndrome and Williams syndrome, are both genetically identifiable disorders. They have massive issues. One actually affects girls far more than boys. There are really short life expectancies from people on Rett syndrome. The behavioral characteristics and the social issues are often very, very, very similar to autism. So they're included in the autism spectrum of disorders, but they are very specific, very rare, and genetically identifiable, whereas we still don't have an accurate genetic test for autism. We are beginning to see some signs of genetic predisposition, but there is no guarantee that a predisposition actually results in the expression of autism in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so this is where things really get fun. Autism is a spectrum of disorders, right? And what it really is at the end of the day is it's a compilation of any number of different traits that are normal human traits, right? And this is where the cultural differences really come in, right? So, for example, in our culture, limited eye contact is one of the key indicators of autism spectrum disorder. But if you're in a culture where you don't make eye contact as a child with an adult, right, if that's just not okay or any superior, that's not going to be an accurate method of diagnosis. So this is one of the things that makes diagnosing autism spectrum really, really challenging, right? Slow response time. And this is something that's in this presentation, there's no way that somebody that's on the spectrum could easily follow this, because at least in an interactive type capacity, because if you ask somebody that's on the spectrum a question, it's going to take time for them to consider and formulate an answer, right? So anybody that's ever seen a real-time, interaction with Stephen Hawking knows that he has to process all of his thoughts into a computer and spit them back out. Echolalia, there's a researcher that was working with a child that had severe echolalia, but that child was able to do the same thing as Stephen Hawking, right? So the way that they solved his echolalia was he actually put everything into a computer, and for them, they actually were able to take and transfer his voice into a synthesized format so that his computer would spit out and it would be his voice speaking. That was the only way that he could interact, because otherwise, he could not process in real time what was being said to him and respond. So response time becomes a real social issue, right? Because then what you've got is you ask a question and you expect an answer in a specific amount of time, and if you then preempt, right, that response, thinking that they haven't heard you, then you might disrupt the cognitive processes that are going on to try and formulate that answer, and then you just start this cycle all over again. So there's a whole lot, right? We talked about difficulty, in understanding and using prosody, right? So all of these things, strict adherence to routines is a big one. So you start looking at these. So imagine now I put 17, examples up here. There's actually a lot more than that, but imagine that there's 17, and it required 5 of those 17 to be able to make a diagnosis of autism. That would get something like 6,100, I think it's 88, just with that 17-5 combination. So you've got 6,000 possible variations of autism spectrum disorder. This is one of the reasons that it is so difficult to make a diagnosis of autism. Then you add in things like comorbidities, right? So if you're using, response time as an issue, as a diagnostic factor, especially with a young child, and they already have hearing difficulties, well, you're not going to get a very accurate, diagnosis. So you have to rule out hearing difficulties, but somebody who's deaf can still be on the spectrum, right? Somebody with Down syndrome can be on the spectrum. I actually know a lady who has a child, or an adult child, who has Downs and autism, and he has a master's degree, and he's outlived his life expectancy by, more than a decade now, right? So, all the doctors at the time said he's autistic and he's Downs. He's going to be, dependent on you for what limited life he's got. And obviously, we're changing a lot of those sort of perspectives as time goes on. But there's also nothing that says that you can't have both like that, and for example, ADHD. But ADHD is a complicated one because a lot of individuals get diagnosed with ADHD instead of autism. And there's reasons for that play into what insurance covers and so forth. And so that's a real problem in making an accurate diagnosis, because we've got the comorbidities and they can also be mutually exclusive, and there's no guarantee that it isn't one or the other. So probably the single most often asked question I get is about autism and vaccines. And in almost every case, the conversation revolves around Dr. Wakefield's retracted paper. And everybody that wants to talk about it, one side or the other, they make this statement, right? And in every case, I ask the people that are, bringing that study up if they actually know the title or even the content of the study. And they're like, nah. So the reality is, it was a gastrointestinal, it was a study about gastrointestinal problems amongst especially children on the autism spectrum. Now, Dr. Wakefield himself has a very specific viewpoint on the pharmaceutical industry, and I think that there are really valid questions to be asked there. And his study did indicate that there was more research needed to determine whether or not there was a connection between vaccines and gastrointestinal disorders But there are multiple studies that have actually followed up on the incidence of gastrointestinal problems amongst individuals with autism, including studies at Harvard and Oxford, and they have confirmed the results of that initial study. So when it comes to this study, right, and any conversation about autism and vaccines, my recommendation, and this is the one takeaway that you should have, is ask them if they know the title of the study, and there it is. Ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children.
One more time.
Yeah, right, yeah. So you can look it up, but if you can walk away saying, you know what, I know that Dr. Wakefield's study was a gastrointestinal study, then that's going to end any conversations that most people have, regardless. And so anyway.
So I'm sorry, just to clarify, so this study and the further studies leading to gastrointestinal problems in autism.
So the other studies really focus more around gastrointestinal disorders amongst individuals with autism, and they confirmed that there's a much higher incidence. There's actually more studies than just those two. I just picked those two out, and so, but this is where we start entering into the real question, right? What is autism, right? And so, and the reason that this slide is next is because, the individuals in the study that Dr. Wakefield, did, and the individuals in those other studies are all in a specific age range, right? And this is where the connection with vaccines really comes in, right? It's because there's this form of autism that I didn't really mention in the group, because at the end of the day, they wind up getting typically, one of those categories of autism as a diagnosis. But there's a specific form of autism that's called regressive autism. It's also called child disintegrated disorder. And it generally appears right around the age of 2 to 3 years old, right? And that's, ish, right? But this also happens to be the same time that we, load up with MMR and so forth. And, in particular, the one child that was mentioned in Dr. Wakefield's study had received the MMR, started to see the regressive form of autism, and developed these gastrointestinal disorders, right? So, and none of the other studies have really come up with any kind of an answer about why there's a prevalence of gastrointestinal disorders among individuals with autism. So, and literally there could be a whole talk just around that, right? Because, that particular topic is that in depth that we've got, multiple studies around the world confirming it, but not coming up with any specific answer as to, why there's such a prevalence of gastrointestinal disorders amongst individuals with autism. But it really, it is a big deal, because, if you've got gastrointestinal problems and you've also got, behavioral traits like, like this, right, then why are you doing that, right? So this is where knowing an individual with autism, becomes so critical, as it makes it so hard to, provide specific assistance on a systemic basis when you don't know why someone's individual behaviors come up, right? So in one really amazing, video I saw, it was a child that was doing their homework, and they would just periodically grab their stomach and they'd bend over and they'd scream. Well, all the doctors kept writing it off as an autistic behavior, right? Well, as it turns out, she had massive gastrointestinal ulcers, right? But doctor after doctor after doctor refused to see her because she was just presenting as autistic, right? But she's grabbing her stomach and she's bending over and screaming. Now, if you or I did that, we'd be able to say, my stomach hurts, right? Well, that's what she was doing. That's how she was saying it, right? So this is where that communication, that expressive language, barrier becomes so critical. You combine that with, sensory processing disorders where you may not even understand how your body is reacting, right? Then, you start to shut down. So this is where all these other symptoms start showing up too, right? If you're not making eye contact, if you can't express yourself, then you're going to get angry, right? Sleeping problems start to come, and at the end of the day, we still don't know why. We don't know why someone develops, into the autism spectrum. We don't know why there's such a propensity towards gastrointestinal problems. These are signs, these are symptoms, and they're how individuals wind up getting to an autism diagnosis. But there are still so many questions. And one of the biggest reasons that we have so little information is there is no medical database to which individuals diagnosed on the autism spectrum are reported, at least not in the United States. The UK is starting to require reporting within that environment. But the United States, almost all of the data about prevalence of autism comes from the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act database, because schools are required to report to the Department of Education how many students are receiving services for autism. But there is no requirement that basis for receiving services be a medical diagnosis. There's no guarantee that a medical diagnosis results in services. So there's a lot of information missing from that. In addition, and unfortunately I don't have access to that chart any longer, but if you look at the ages at which individuals on the spectrum get services in public schools, it peaks at around age 11 and then plummets, right? And it's because, it's not because, they're suddenly no longer on the autism spectrum or no longer, have, issues that are, associated with that, but because they are no longer eligible to receive services, right? Now that also can be, they're starting in middle school, right? That's a really massive change. A lot of kids on the spectrum, they wind up getting pulled out of school and homeschooled because the schools are unable to provide services at the level that they need, right? And so, a lot of people also then associate autism as a result of that data with simply being a childhood issue. But it's not. Autism is a lifelong issue, right? It affects people in their ability to function in society, to get jobs, to keep jobs, right? I mean, think about how important social interaction is just in terms of getting a job, right? I mean, you have to sit in front of someone and interact with them in an interview. I mean, there is probably no more stressful circumstance that we can come up with in our lives than that one right there, right? And then after you get through that process, then you have to sit, and work with colleagues and sustain that. So there are a lot of problems with adults on the spectrum that are only just now starting to come to light as we start to get a better handle on, some of the information that's out there. Now, one group that is using medical diagnosis, as part of their, determination about the prevalence of autism is the Centers for Disease Control, right? But they use a very small sample set from just 11 sites around the U.S., and their most recent model suggests that 1 in 59 are on the autism spectrum, right? That's on the in the U.S. But again, without an actual medical database to report people to, so that we can track them throughout their lifespan, we have no big data model to validate the statistical models. And that's one of the reasons that every couple of years this statistical model is going down. So if you look in the 1990s, for example, the incidence of autism was 1 in 10,000. Now we're at 1 in 59. Well, that can't possibly be accurate, right? There's no way that those two models are consistent. And that is because the statistical model has been changing constantly. Part of this is about awareness, but part of this is because one of the things that also tends to happen is that children get diagnosed, then later on their parents go, and one or the other or both of the parents wind up getting a diagnosis themselves, right? Well, you'll never see that in the IDEA database because they're not in public schools. They're not getting access to services, right? So this model is evolving over time, and we don't have the data that we need to get a really good handle on what those numbers are. And yet, right, this is where we can see, right? So let's see here. I don't know if I can. Is it working? I can't do it. Go ahead. Okay, so there we are, right? 1995, right? This is how many kids, fewer than 2,000 kids were receiving services for autism in Oregon public schools, right? Now as of the year before last, we're at over 10,000, right? So the CDC's data says that we've seen a 15% increase, over the previous 5-year period, right? And so this growth chart here, right? This red one, shows this is our trend, right? And this is again partially about awareness. But the reality, again, like I said, is that we don't have all these homeschool kids, all the private school kids, or any kids that are no longer eligible to receive services on this list. So the reality is, the actual numbers, they're actually more logarithmic. I mean, it's just, or, exponential probably. Now, how many of those probably were on the spectrum before? We don't know because we don't have accurate information. And so, but again, this leads into all these kids, they've moved on, they graduate, they continue to move on and graduate. They go out into college, right? So colleges are starting to do a lot more outreach and preparation and provide specific assistance for adults that are on the spectrum that are getting into college because the dropout rate is very, very high. I mentioned earlier that consistent employment is a huge problem. So I can't tell you how many adults have come to me and said, I keep trying. I go in, I get a job. I'm there for a couple of weeks. Nobody likes me. I get fired, I quit, whatever. And of course, you continue to face those kinds of issues along with basic social interaction skills that affect your ability to form, any kind of relationships. And it results in really high incidence of depression amongst adults and in particular, or adolescents and in particular adults. So the depression incidence amongst autistic adults is markedly higher than it is amongst other individuals, but neurotypical individuals. But again, right, what that actual incidence is, we don't know because we don't have a database that compares the incidence from a medical perspective on a national level. We know that it's high, and there have been studies that say that it's markedly higher, somewhere in the vicinity of 14 to 20%, but they all say the same thing. Every single study says the reality is we don't know because we don't know how many adults are on the spectrum. There are, however, a lot more services emerging to help individuals. In fact, one professional that I know in New York, her entire therapy model is about assisting relationships between individuals that are on the spectrum and their neurotypical partner. How to bridge those gaps, how to sustain a relationship over that time. This is a huge issue, just from having autism in the family. Some statistics show that the divorce rate amongst couples that are that have a child on the spectrum is as high as 80%. This is pretty consistent amongst most disabilities. It's very stressful. And then there's that question of family dependence, right? So the son of the executive director for the autism nonprofit that I work with, he is in his 30s now. He has limited, but starting to develop expressive language. But he has a really substantial receptive language capacity, right? But because of his needs, even though he's fully employed, right, he has to have an aide, right? Now his job, right, is he's a stock guy at the grocery store, right? So we're talking about lining things up, ordered structures, pattern recognition, right? Things that for a lot of individuals on the spectrum are strong skills. Well, he just wants to stack all that stuff up, right? That's awesome. This one goes here, this one goes here, this one goes here. You point it to him, and as long as you don't change anything, everything's fine, right? Otherwise, you need give him a little bit of guidance, and then he'll go do it. Sorting recycling, he loves to do that, right? So he has a job, but there's no way that he'd be able to get to and from that job on his own, right? So their entire lives as a couple has been to prepare for their death to take over for somebody to take over, for him to live in the house after they're gone. And so that family dependency for the the most severely affected, it's literally their entire lives has revolved around that. So I think I've sort of mentioned this, but there's a lot more that we don't know than what we do. Research and provision for services for individuals on the autism spectrum has dramatically increased, in particular over the course of the last 20 years. And the last 15 years is probably more than quadrupled. I mean, it has just been a staggering growth of information. Now, organizations like Autism Speaks that have taken this issue, nationally and internationally, have really driven a lot of that. They've put a lot of funding into it, but we still have a lot of problems with accurate and consistent diagnosis. So, to sort of emphasize that point, there's one study that I saw that took and recorded the clinical diagnostic session of a child on the autism spectrum. And they put that same video in front of multiple panels of experts. Now, mind you, when we're talking about panels of experts, we're talking about psychologists, developmental psychologists, pediatric, physicians, hearing and speech, people. So there's generally a variety, occupational therapists. There's like 4 or 5 disciplines that are almost always involved in some of the more comprehensive diagnosis. And that same presentation from that same individual resulted in different diagnoses from different groups of people. Right? So how people interpret that and what their specific level of training is and where they were trained and what they look for, it so varies that this is another area where our ability to really accurately identify the scope and the magnitude of what is autism, and how many people are affected by it is still really, really inconsistent, and it's hard to get a handle on it. And in no small part because, again, there are comorbidities like ADHD that presents in such a similar fashion, as well as the more genetic areas. So Williams syndrome, for example, typically there are some physical issues that you can see. So that's attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders.
There's also ADD,
attention deficit disorder, right?
and that's just the only difference is hyperactivity.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And in both cases, ADD and ADHD, the attention deficit portion is one of those things that, again, it's its own presentation, but a lot of us, just sort of culturally think attention deficit. It means that they can't pay attention to something, right? And yet, a child that has, attention deficit disorder can sit down and do one thing for hours and hours and hours and hours. They can watch video games, they can watch movies, they can read books, they can do all these things. So how can it be attention deficit disorder? And the reason is because it's not actually about attention deficit per se. It's about the hyper focus on an issue and the inability to transition from that topic to another one, knowing in particular that this one isn't done. Right? So it's one thing to wash your hands and know that you're going to leave the bathroom, right? That doesn't result in sort of a tension. But if you're partway through a book and you haven't finished it and you know that you're going to have to come back to it, but you have to leave and go eat dinner, that results in a stress, right? So this is where ADHD comes in. Well, if you're on the autism spectrum and you have a specific ritual routine, that can present the same way. I'm changing, so I'm doing something right now, and I have to leave that thing and go do something else. How do I make myself transition? So, again, you can have both, or it can be one or the other, and it makes it really hard to make that diagnosis, especially in children, right, who are still trying to figure all that stuff out. I mean, anybody that's been in a classroom full of 2-year-olds or second graders knows that. So, again, there's a lot that we still need to learn. We know that it's a neurological disorder, right? So it's not just a learning disorder, right? Because it affects, the ability for people to interpret, their various sensory, experiences. We know that it's, a unique experience. There's an expression in the autism community that's, if you've met an individual on the autism spectrum, you've met an individual, on the autism spectrum. Because those experiences are so culturally specific as well as unique to an individual, it makes that, that very, very unique to that individual. And yet, there's a set of behaviors that affects people for their entire lives. Even the most highly functioning people that work in Intel, that I know that, if you look at, I often talk about the career paths that high functioning individuals on the autism spectrum tend to gravitate towards. They tend to be careers that don't require a lot of social interaction, right? And they tend to be very procedural and methodical, right? Engineers, right? The IT industry, right? Airplane pilots, medical researchers, right? Career paths that tend to be also have a concentration of very highly specialized knowledge, right? That also gives them a very specific set of things that they can talk about, right? If you can find your way into the right career, you generally do very well. But it, again, depends on your ability to have expressive language and to get that job. So there's a lot of conditions that really affect this. And it affects people around the world. The Koreas and India, believe it or not, actually have one of the highest incidents of autism on the planet, right? So there was some initial work that suggested that perhaps, climate had something to do with it. Well, that's kind of hard to determine. Vitamin D, however, would be something that could play a significant role, especially if you look at the increase, because the increase in incidence seems to have, paralleled things like the emergence of television, computers, air conditioning, all things that have moved us from, being people that work outside to people that work inside. There's a lot of research going into that, right? Especially in pregnant mothers, for example. It's a disorder that exists alongside other conditions, right? So there's nothing, again, that prevents you from having autism and not and having something else. It's complicated. It's hard to diagnose. Parents don't like it, right? One of the things I didn't mention about the number of kids receiving services, in schools, is that the parents have to agree to those services. So a child can absolutely be determined to be on the autism spectrum, and the parents don't agree to the services, so therefore the child doesn't get the services, so now they're also left off, right? So we've got a lot of social stigmas surrounding autism that really affects this too, and the notion that somehow having that label is going to, impair or limit a child's development.
So just a quick time check.
Yep.
I don't know how much you have left.
2 slides.
Okay.
So, at the end of the day, we're talking about something with huge socioeconomic impacts, and that, requires us to really challenge our perceptions of what it is to be human, first of all, because, everything that we're talking about, each particular criteria is something that someone can identify with. Lack of eye contact is someone who's shy, for example, or being respectful, depending on the circumstances, right? So there are things that really affect, us as individuals and our coworkers, and people that we meet, and people in our own families. So actually, I guess that was the last one. So what is autism? The reality is that we still don't have a handle on exactly what autism is.
Thank you, Dan. There you have it. There's a ton of information in a short amount of time about autism. Thank you, Dan, for sharing. I hope that you enjoyed this and learned something. If you did, please comment, tell us what you think below, or reach out to Dan. And if you like these videos, please subscribe to see more updates like these. We're going to be posting every single weekend. Until next time, see ya. Cheers.